Welcome to Marx 1013. My name is Bernard Harcourt, and this is the full-length introduction to the seminar, Marx 1013, with Cornel West, where we will be discussing Marx's mature political economic writings in conversation with Cedric Robinson's book, Black Marxism. Let me introduce the seminar. We now reach, on our year-long journey, the most famous political economic writings of Marx. First, his publication of a contribution to the critique of political economy in 1859, and second, the release of his magnum opus, Capital, Volume 1, in 1867. There is, of course, more to come, including not only the 3 other volumes of Capital, which were published posthumously, but also Marx's writings on the Paris uprising during the Commune, titled The Civil War in France, 1871, and the voluminous late Marx writings. But for now, we can at least imagine that we have covered the young and the mature Marx, and have in our grasp what most people refer to when they critique Marx or Marxism. In this particular section, Marx 1013, we read Marx through the lens of Cedric Robinson's landmark work, Black Marxism, the Making of the Black Radical Tradition. Although famous today, Robinson's book almost fell through the cracks when it was published, and likely would have fallen through the cracks had it not been for a provocative book review published in the Monthly Review in 1988 by Cornel West, who at the time was a professor of religion and the director of the Afro-American Studies Program at Princeton University. Cornel West shattered what critics would later call the conspiracy of silence that surrounded Robinson's book. In West's characteristic way, he propelled Black Marxism into our contemporary debates. For this and many other reasons, it's an absolute privilege and honor to welcome our dear colleague and friend and our faithful friend to these 1313 seminars, Dr. Cornel West, to welcome him back to Columbia University and to welcome him to Marx 1313. Cornel West is coming right off of his 2024 presidential campaign with the Justice for All Party, and he's back with us here at Columbia, of course, and at the Union Theological Seminary, our affiliate school of divinity, where he is the Dietrich Bonhoeffer Professor of Philosophy and Christian Practice. It's really thrilling to have Cornel West with us to read and discuss Marx's mature writings in conversation with Cedric Robinson's Black Marxism. Now, in this full-length introduction, I will set the background to our conversation with Cornel West by giving some context to the 2 Marx texts, A Contribution to the Critique of Political Economy and Capital, Volume 1, and to Cedric Robinson's book, Black Marxism. I would like to start, though, even before discussing Marx's text, with a certain disclaimer about Black Marxism, especially those who have not yet gotten through the lengthy 436-page book. The title of Cedric Robinson's book, Black Marxism, is a bit misleading, I would argue. And I think in part this explains why the book didn't receive as much attention as it deserved. Now, although the title is Black Marxism, the book does not propose a variant or a strand or an offshoot of Marxism that would account for the Black experience. It does not advocate for a new version of Marxism, by contrast to the many other Marxist projects. It operates in a very different way than most Marxisms. Most forms of Marxism, whether past or present, and by which I mean offshoots of the original narrow Engelsian Marxism, kind of the classic Marxism that Friedrich Engels constructed after Marx's death, involving, for instance, the doctrine of historical materialism or of the dictatorship of the proletariat. Most forms of Marxism in that tradition start with a critique of a certain aspect of Marx's writings or a critique of other Marxisms, but then effectively appropriate Marx for themselves. They claim to be the true or genuine Marxists, the more comprehensive theorists of Marx, the more authentic Marx. Feminist Marxism and the wages for housework movement, for example, which we discussed at Marx 613, starts with a critique of Marx for failing to pay sufficient attention to social reproduction in the home, especially by contrast to industrial production in the factory. But by the end of the critique, it has transformed itself into a more compelling or genuine expression of Marxism, at a minimum into a leading strand of Marxism that proposes a feminist communist horizon. Similarly, transgender Marxism, which we discussed at Marx 513, starts from the criticism that Marx's writings do not adequately address the questions of sexuality, gender, and the family, but it develops into a form of transgender communism that aspires to be a leading voice within Marxism, not just a peripheral or marginalized voice or a tag-along. Now, many other forms of Marxism that build on the original edifice have as well sought to correct particular readings of Marx, but have claimed to be kind of a more genuine or correct version. This is true on the gamut, whether you think about analytical Marxism or even Leninist Marxism or even Stalinism, right, which claimed diamat, the theory of dialectical materialism that Stalin developed in the chapter Dialectical and Historical Materialism, that claimed that as the official Marxist doctrine. By contrast, Robinson's Black Marxism has no ambition to be a strand of Marxism, nor to be genuinely Marxist. It too begins with a critique of Marx, primarily focused on its Eurocentrism and the fact that it was focusing on European industrial workers rather than taking a longer durée. But it does not claim to reconstitute a form of Marxism. Instead, it unearths a history of European racialism that Marx pretty much ignored, and develops instead a black radical tradition that is intended to be autonomous, independent of Marxism, even if it's in conversation with Marx's writings. The black radical tradition that Cedric Robinson unearths here is precisely not a form of black Marxism. It is not a branch of Marxism. So in this sense, Robinson's reading of Marx and his ambition is much closer to Frantz Fanon's project, right, which was to displace the Western industrial worker as the agent of history by the wretched of the earth. Fanon had no intention of creating a post-colonial Marxism. He was too busy writing and participating in the struggle for Algerian liberation. In a similar way, Robinson's ambition was far greater than developing a branch of Marxism or even black Marxism. He was much more interested instead in a separate and autonomous development, going back centuries and spanning the globe, that he called the black radical tradition. It's important, I think, to start there in order to better situate our seminar discussion and to better situate the critique of Marx that we find in Cedric Robinson's work. Now, with that stage setting, let me turn then to our texts, and let me start with a contribution to the critique of political economy from 1859. In February 1857, as he was completing the 6th of the 7 notebooks that would comprise the Grundrisse, and that we studied last week with Michael Hart and Sandro Mezzadra. In February 1857, Marx began to seek out an editor to publish the work, the Grundrisse, and its elaboration in German. Marx had the ambition of publishing his work in a 6-volume book series. He had initially set the contours of the larger multi-volume project at the end of his introduction to the Grundrisse, as I noted in my long-form introduction to the Grundrisse for Marx 913, and described it there. Marx had formulated the following plan for the multi-volume series, and it included 6 books. The first would have been the kind of general determinants of the forms of society, so questions of labor and capital. The second was going to look at the categories which make up the inner structure of bourgeois society and their interrelationship. Town and country, 3 classes, social classes, exchanges, circulation, credit system. Then there would be a book on the concentration of bourgeois society in the form of the state. Looking at the state, taxes, state debt, public credit, the population, colonies, immigration. Then something on international relation of production, international division of labor, international exchange, export and import, and then finally a book on the world market and crises. Now, Marx boiled this down to a simpler 6-book outline in a letter to Ferdinand Lassalle dated February 22, 1858. And the overall project he described as, quote, a critique of economic categories, or if you like, a critical expose of the system of the bourgeois economy. It is at once an expose and, by the same token, a critique of the system. And in his letter to Lassalle in February 1858, Marx outlined the 6 books as follows. First, on capital. Second, on landed property. Third, on wage labor. Fourth, on the state. Fifth, on international trade. And sixth, on the world market. Now, by the following month, March 1858, Marx had already secured a publisher in Berlin by the name of Duncker, and he had agreed to turn over the manuscript in pieces to be printed in installments. By contrast to the Grundrisse, which started with 1 chapter on money, you'll recall, and another on capital, Marx planned to begin the first book of the series on capital with 3 chapters: value, money, and capital in general, he said. The process of production of capital, process of its circulation, the unity of the two, or capital and profit interest. Marx worked on these parts, sending them off to the printer in January 1859. Ultimately, he reduced them to 2 chapters. The first titled The Commodity, and the second titled Money, or Simple Circulation. Now, ultimately, only the first installment would ever be published, and it was published in June 1859 under the title Zur Kritik der politischen Ökonomie, erstes Heft, so a contribution to the critique of political economy, first part. And the subtitle of the book was Book 1 on Capital, Section 1, Capital in General, and it contained a preface and 2 chapters, The Commodity and Money or Simple Circulation, as well as notes in annex and appendices. Now, it should be intuitively obvious how the work gradually takes the shape that it does, starting with commodities and then turning to money before discussing capital. That is, after all, the best framework to understand the CMC formula with which Marx starts Capital, Chapter 4, a few years later, and which he will call the quote, simplest form of the circulation of commodities, i.e., the transformation of commodities into money and the change of the money back again into commodities or selling in order to buy. And that's what you have then at the beginning of a contribution to the critique of political economy, right? A section on commodity and a section on money. The book is published in 1859, and the first English translation is published in Chicago in 1904, several years later, by Charles Kerr and Company. Most readers of Marx are pretty much only familiar with the preface to the book, which is renowned for containing Marx's intellectual autobiography and the famous statement of what became known as historical materialism. So let me say a word about the preface. The preface, of course, is a tour de force that contains both Marx's short but comprehensive retrospective on his intellectual journey, much of which I have quoted separately in the previous introductions, and contains as well a succinct restatement of his material theory of history. So first, Marx simply states in this preface that the 6 volumes that he intends to publish, and he names them for the reader. He writes, "I examine the system of bourgeois economy in the following order: capital, landed property, wage labor, the state, foreign trade, world market." Then Marx recounts his intellectual journey and how he got there and how his different experiences led him to study political economy. It's in the middle of that account, right, actually kind of in right smack in the middle of his own autobiography, that he sets forth the summary of his theory of history. It's, of course, very well known, but it's worth rehearsing here at this point, since it was written in January 1859 and fits in the chronology right here. In the famous passage, I quoted at length in the introduction, in the written introduction online. Let me just start with the passage that we come back to all the time. He writes, "In the social production of their existence, men inevitably enter into definite relations, which are independent of their will, namely relations of production appropriate to a given stage in the development of the material forces of production. The totality of these relations of production constitutes the economic structure of society, the real foundation, on which arises a legal and political superstructure, and to which correspond different forms of social consciousness. The mode of production of material life conditions the general process of social, political, and intellectual life. It is not the consciousness of men that determines their existence, but their social existence that determines their consciousness. At a certain stage of development, the material productive forces of society come into conflict with the existing relations of production, or, this merely expresses the same thing in legal terms, with the property relations within the framework of which they have operated hitherto. From forms of development of the productive forces, these relations turn into their fetters. Then begins an era of social revolution. The changes in the economic foundation lead, sooner or later, to the transformation of the whole immense superstructure." Now, Marx goes on in 2 long paragraphs to flesh this out, but I think that you get here a very clear sense of the material theory of history that he has kind of synthesized now in 1859 as a preface to all of his work on political economy. as a preface to his work on capital, but also, eventually, on the state, international relations, and the world market. So he publishes the first sections on commodity and money. And following the publication of those first sections, the first part in 1859, Marx continues on and off to draft subsequent parts of the intended books. The draft manuscripts for the immediate next part, the third intended chapter on capital in general, those manuscripts mushroom into 23 notebooks that Marx titles A Contribution to the Critique of Political Economy, third chapter, Capital in General, but that he would not publish. These are generally referred to as the 1861-63 manuscripts. They were not published by Marx, and they included the Theories of Surplus Value, a tome that Karl Kautsky would publish in 1905 to 1910 as Volume 4 of Capital. 8 years later, in 1867, Marx then publishes the first volume of Capital. Now, to recall, the contribution had two chapters, commodity and market, or simple circulation. It should be intuitively obvious how that work would gradually take the shape that it does in Capital, starting with commodities and then turning to money before discussing capital. That is, after all, the best framework to understand the CMC formula, right? Now, Marx wrote that he intended Capital as a continuation of a contribution to the critique of political economy, the first part, which had appeared 8 years earlier. He indicated that, quote, the substance of that earlier work is summarized in the first 3 chapters of this volume. And of course, that's what we see, and that is the way that the Volume 1 of Capital begins. Now, the idea of giving an introduction to Capital, Volume 1, in 1,000 words seems preposterous. I'm actually considering making next year's 1313 series entirely about Capital and the volumes of Capital, since we are not going to have the proper amount of time in these few seminars to discuss Capital properly at this point, especially because we have to turn to the late Marx, which is today such a rich topic, with a session with Kohei Saito, a session with Bruno Bostiels, and a session with Etienne Balibar. So we can't really do justice here to Capital Volume 1, and I will try to write a separate long-form introduction shortly. Here I also will not even try to give an introduction to the other volumes of Capital, but I will say this, just to prefigure the posthumous works. Marx intended Capital to consist of 4 books distributed over 3 volumes. So when he gets there in 1867, right, he's changed the composition in mind, and he intends to do the following 4 books cut up into 3 volumes. The 4 books included, first, the process of capitalist production; second, the process of capitalist circulation; third, the process of capitalist production as a whole, which is the interrelationship of production and circulation; and 4, a history of theories of surplus value. Now, Marx only published the first volume during his lifetime. Engels published the second 2 planned books as volumes 2 and 3, and then Karl Kautsky published the final book on theories of surplus value as volume 4. So now let us read Marx's mature work then in conversation in this seminar with Cedric Robinson's book, Black Marxism, the full title of which is Black Marxism, The Making of the Black Radical Tradition. Cedric Robinson, a professor of political science and black studies at the University of California in Santa Barbara, publishes Black Marxism in 1983 with the University of North Carolina Press. It's an academic press with a leading reputation in the field of history. Now, the subtitle of the book, The Making of the Black Radical Tradition, contains an allusion to the British Marxist historian E.P. Thompson's famous book, The Making of the English Working Class, which serves as one of the main foils and the main foil in the second chapter of Robinson's book. E.P. Thompson's book is central to Robinson's argument, specifically his argument that Thompson, as well, failed to recognize the role of race and racialism in the construction of the industrial English working class. Here, specifically, failed to recognize the role of the racial hierarchies that subjugated the Irish race and ignored the race struggles between what Robinson calls the two races in the working class, namely the Irish and the British, and failed and ignored to understand the racialism in the making of the English working class. Now, Cedric Robinson's book operates in three movements, which correspond to the three parts of the book. First, Robinson pushes back several centuries the context for the emergence of capitalism in Europe and demonstrates the centrality of the race wars to European history. And here he has in mind the race wars going back to the struggles in the 9th and 10th centuries between peoples such as the Ostrogoths and the Visigoths, the Vandals and their Burgundies, the Frank peoples. Of course, all of this in the remnants of the Roman Empire. Drawing on the research of medieval historians such as Henri Pirenne, of the Annales School of Historiography, especially Fernand Braudel, and of the world systems theory of Emmanuel Wallerstein, Robinson offers an alternative arc to the conventional history of capitalism. Alternative, that is, to the traditional Marxist emphasis on European industrialization and that particular moment at the turn of the 19th century that gave birth to the industrial working class. Robinson conducts, in effect, a history of European racialism that serves as a genealogy of capitalism. By stretching the time frame back to the medieval and pre-medieval period and loosening the connection to industrialization, Robinson spotlights at the heart of the movement towards capitalism the struggles between peoples, or between races as they were referred to, during the early medieval period, which resulted in slavery and the slave trade of, at the time, predominantly European and Mediterranean enslaved persons. He highlights in the 13th to 15th centuries the importance of, quote, Tartar, Greek, Armenian, Russian, Bulgarian, Turkish, Circassian, Slavonic, Cretan, Arab, African, Mori, and occasionally Chinese Cathay slaves, 2/3 of whom were female, of course, in the homes and in the fields of southern Europe. In a sense, Robinson eases the Western reader in the first part of the book into the role that slavery, and especially later slavery of African peoples, would play in this genealogy of capitalism. And he does so by starting centuries earlier than chattel slavery in the Americas and showing the predominance of European slaves in the economies of Southern Europe. As noted earlier, Robinson follows that up with a chapter on E.P. Thompson, where he underscores the role of the race war between the Irish and English in the making of the English working class. Again, easing the Western reader into the struggle between two European races. For those who are familiar with Michel Foucault's work, Robinson's genealogy overlaps in part with Foucault's argument in his Collège de France lectures in 1976, Society Must Be Defended, that the emergence of social defense theories in the 19th century were the outgrowth of the race wars of the pre-medieval and medieval periods. Foucault focused in 1976 on the Franks, the Gauls, the Celts, and the other peoples of northern and southern Europe, who were the center of attention of a historical discourse about race war or race struggle. What Foucault referred to as, quote, that old discourse, already hundreds of years old, presented in socio-biological terms, that was reworked for purposes of social conservatism and colonial domination. Now, Foucault's intervention there was to ask how it came about that the race wars were replaced by class struggle, how the race wars in early Europe metamorphized into class wars. He specifically refers to Marx's acknowledgement in a letter written to Joseph Wiedemeyer on March 5th, 1852, which I discussed in the introduction to Marx 8:13. Right? He specifically refers to Marx's acknowledgement in that letter that he had not been the first, Marx that is, had not been the first to identify class struggle, but that instead the French bourgeois historian, especially Augustin Thierry, had done that long before him. Now, Foucault gets his references crossed in his 1967 lectures, citing instead to a letter to Engels in 1882. He's clearly quoting from memory, but the slip is fruitful, particularly productive, because, perhaps unintentionally, but very productively, Foucault brings into the conversation explicitly the question of race wars for Marx. He recalls, he's ad-libbing Marx's letter, and he ad-libs it in the following terms, quote, you know very well where we found our idea of class struggle. We found it in the work of the French historians who talked about the race struggle. Now, he's kind of projecting the race struggle into Marx's letter, but it is, of course, it was part of what the French historians were doing. So Foucault in 1976 draws a direct line between race wars and Marxist class struggle, or what he refers to as, in his own words, quote, the time when the notion of race struggle was about to be replaced by that of class struggle. Foucault locates that, quote, in the first half of the 19th century, as it was Adolphe Thiers who transformed race struggle into class struggle. And Thiers did this in his 10-volume History of the French Revolution. Thiers published that from 1823 to 1827. And incidentally, for anyone interested in this, the French political theorist Florence Hulac discusses this in detail in her new book, Histoire libérale de la modernité, Race, Nation, Classe, liberal history of modernity, race, nation, class. Now, for Foucault, this transition from race wars to class wars leads to a short discussion of colonization, of colonizing genocide, of Nazism, of Soviet state racism, and modern forms of racism, as well as a much longer discussion of social defense theory and the creation of the concept of the internal enemy. And of course, that's what gives the name to the title of those lectures, society must be defended, in quotations, right? That was social defense theory. For Cedric Robinson, though, the discussion does not end there. Robinson explores how those early race wars in the run-up to the Middle Ages metamorphose into the enslavement and conquest of African people and indigenous people in the Americas, into the Atlantic slave trade, colonialism, colonial plantations, and ultimately into the racialized formation of industrial labor. For Robinson, the race wars formed the basis for an alternative genealogy of capitalism. Now, by the end of the first part, Robinson has outlined 4 sections, 4 periods for his genealogy of European racialism, only the first 2 of which reside mostly in the field of European history, the last 2 being more global and worldly. The first period predates the Middle Ages, but extends into them and into feudalism. It is the early, formative period of the race wars, already discussed, and what he calls the, quote, blood and racial beliefs and legends. The second period covers the gradual dominance of Arab, Ottoman, and African cultures over the Mediterranean basin, bringing about what are called the quote-unquote Dark Ages in Europe. The third period consists of the emergence of merchant capitalism from late feudalism and the development of a world system, a la Wallerstein, a world system that overtakes Africa, Asia, and the Americas. And the fourth period, Robinson labels the, quote, dialectic of colonialism, plantocratic slavery, and resistance from the 16th century forward, and the formations of industrial labor and labor reserves. Robinson's point is that these 4 moments of European racialism shaped the social relations of production at all the different economic stages. They serve as the context within which capitalism emerges. As he writes, quote, racialism insinuated not only medieval, feudal, and capitalist social structures, forms of property, and modes of production, but as well the very values and traditions of consciousness through which the peoples of these ages came to understand their worlds and their experiences. Now, having discussed the first moment in the first part of the book, Robinson then elaborates on the other 3 moments in the second part of the book. This is where he recounts, first, the stages of capitalist development grounded on slavery, on the slave trade, and on the dehumanization of African peoples. Robinson traces how European merchants and entrepreneurs substituted slaves, enslaved persons for commodities, and how the slave trade transformed mercantile into industrial capitalism. This is the work that we are familiar with today under the rubric of racial capitalism. Cedric Robinson uses that term from the inception of his book, right on the second page of the book and throughout the book. And in large part, Robinson coined the usage of the term racial capitalism that we use today, even if others had employed the term earlier. One of the first scholars to popularize the term was actually Neville Alexander, a South African revolutionary who spent a decade on Robben Island with Nelson Mandela. Neville Alexander used the term in the 1970s to describe the South African apartheid political economy. He deployed it in a dual way to confront both Marxists and liberals. As Karen Engel explains, Alexander theorized racial capitalism to argue against liberal claims that apartheid could be ended without ending capitalism, on the one hand, and Marxist claims that dismantling capitalism would necessarily lead to racial equality, on the other. So, part 2, though, does more than just trace the oppressive dimensions of racialism in the later periods and outside of the European context. It also spotlights the forms of resistance and the struggles of black peoples, thereby setting the stage for a black radical tradition as opposed to Western radicalism. And in the third part of the book, it's the intellectual and theoretical contributions of black radical thinkers that emerges. In a similar way to the way in which W.E.B. Du Bois transformed the enslaved black people into the agents of emancipation, into the subjects of history in black reconstruction in America, as we discuss with Gayatri Spivak at Marx 713, Robinson documents the pervasive forms of black resistance from the 16th century onwards in Mexico, Brazil, Venezuela, Haiti, the French and British Guianas, the British West Indies, the Dutch Suriname, and throughout North America. Throughout these analyses, Robinson is constantly trying to extract, in his words, the ideological, this is his words, quote, the ideological, philosophical, and epistemological natures of the black movement, whose dialectical matrix, we believe, was capitalist slavery and imperialism. And what Robinson finds is an ethic tied to an African tradition. No mass violence, violence often turned inward, far from what the Westerners thought would have been necessary to end slavery. And also, as Robinson notes, much less brutal than what Frantz Fanon proposed. This was not, Robinson writes, quote, the fratricide of Fanon's extended Freudianism. It becomes clear then, Robinson writes, that for the period between the mid-16th and mid-19th century, it was an African tradition that grounded collective resistance by blacks to slavery and colonial imperialism. This African tradition, Robinson maintains, privileged the mind over the body, the metaphysical over the material, and it privileged escape, resettlement, or suicide over violence and assault. Robin refers to it in terms of, quote, mind, metaphysics, ideology, consciousness. And he summarizes it in the following terms as, quote, the continuing development of a collective consciousness informed by the historical struggles for liberation and motivated by the shared sense of obligation to preserve the collective being, the ontological totality. Now, this black radical tradition, according to Robinson, is different in important ways from Western Marxism and from European radicalism, particularly the kind of radical thought and praxis personified in revolutionaries like Lenin, Mao, Fidel, Lumumba, or Ho Chi Minh. For Robinson, it stood against the European ways of thinking and being. It had been subjugated by the latter, but it did not resonate with the former. It has an entirely different culture, sensibility, ethos, philosophy, symbolism, semiotics, epistemology than Western Marxism. As Robinson writes, and here's a quote, the black radical tradition cast doubt on the extent to which capitalism penetrated and reformed social life and on its ability to create entirely new categories of human experience stripped bare of the historical consciousness embedded in culture. It gave them cause to question the authority of a radical intelligentsia drawn by its own analyses from marginal and ambiguous social strata to construct an adequate manifestation of proletarian power. And it drew them more and more toward the actual discourse of revolutionary masses, the impulse to make history in their own terms. And finally, the Black radical tradition forced them to reevaluate the nature and historical roles of ideology and consciousness. After all, it had been as an emergent African people, and not as slaves, that Black men and women opposed enslavement. So the Black radical tradition, Robinson concludes, has a life of its own, independent and autonomous from European radical traditions, and entirely distinct from Marxism. That then brings Robinson to analyze, in the third part of the book, the radical thought of W.E.B. Du Bois, C.L.R. James, and Richard Wright, three brilliant critical philosophers who engaged Marx's writings and the Marxist tradition of critique and praxis. For anyone who's interested, and I put the link on the written introduction, we studied, of course, W.E.B. Du Bois earlier this year at Marx 713, but also previously with Gayatri Spivak, Bob Gooding Williams, and others throughout Abolition Democracy 1313. We studied C.L.R. James with Adom Getachew a few years ago at Revolution 213. And we also discussed Richard Wright with Biodun Jeyifo at Revolution 113, specifically in the context of the First International Congress of Black Writers and Artists, held at the Sorbonne in Paris in September 1959. If you're interested in learning more about them, then I point you to those seminars on the website. Now, just to stay with Du Bois, as we saw earlier, Du Bois developed a framework in Black Reconstruction in America, published in 1935, that directly engaged Marx's theories of class struggle, of counter-revolution, and of emancipation. Amy Allen's essay, Slavery, Work, and Property, Du Bois's Black Marxism, is particularly enlightening on this question. And again, I'll link to it on the website. What Robinson does is to trace the way Du Bois gradually distances himself from the Marxist tradition and comes to embrace the Black radical tradition. Through an analysis of Du Bois's writings and of the historical context regarding the relationships between labor unions, the American Communist Party, Lenin, and the Comintern on the Black question, and blacks in America, Robinson demonstrates how Du Bois is better interpreted within the Black radical tradition, especially by the end of his life. So Robinson concludes, quote, Du Bois, despite all the diversions and distractions of intellect, social origins, and ambition that had marked his even then long life, had at last come to the Black radical tradition. This is then the main argument that he makes in that third part, that these authors who were directly engaged with Marx's writings and Marxist movements are better understood through the lens of the Black radical tradition that Cedric Robinson excavates over the centuries of resistance. So let me conclude this discussion of Cedric Robinson's book with a telling passage from his own conclusion on page 313, where he writes, when Du Bois and James set about the recovery of the history of the revolutionary black struggle, they were driven from an implied to an explicit critique of Marxism. It appeared to them that Western Marxists, unconsciously bound by a Eurocentric perspective, could not account for nor correctly assess the revolutionary forces emerging from the Third World. The racial metaphysics of Western consciousness, the legacy of a civilization shielded their fellow socialists from the recognition of racialism's influence on the development and structure of the capitalist system. I think that gives you a good summary of Robinson's intervention. Now to the reception of Robinson's Black Marxism. The book was published again in 1983 by an esteemed academic press known for highest quality historical work, but the book received very little attention at first. There was what some critics have called a conspiracy of silence, a protracted silence, at least until Cornel West published a landmark book review of Black Marxism in the Monthly Review in September 1988, 5 years later, both praising and critiquing the work. Robinson's book is a towering achievement, West writes. There is simply nothing like it in the history of Black radical thought. And with that, Cornel West's book review propelled Robinson's Black Marxism into the heart of contemporary debates. Now, in that essay, Dr. West notes that Robinson's book had fallen through the cracks, neglected both by scholars of Black studies and by the left intelligentsia more broadly. He emphasizes that they ignore it at their own peril, or at least at the risk of sidestepping the most important questions of our time, namely, how to engage properly in the struggle for emancipation. West highlights the import of Robinson's main ambitions, and he characterizes them in the following terms, which are extremely helpful, I think. 1. To show that efforts to understand Black people's history of resistance through the exclusive prism of Marxist analyses are incomplete and inaccurate. And 2, to contribute to the freedom struggle of oppressed people by exploring the ways in which the Marxist tradition, indispensable for the struggle, may impede it through its Eurocentric focuses. I'll come back to that aside that Cornel West makes about the Marxist tradition, indispensable to the struggle, in a moment. Now, Dr. West was more enamored by the first 2 parts of the book than the third. Regarding Robinson's analysis of European racialism, West lauds Robinson for highlighting the failure of European and Marxist radical thought to account for the place of race and racialism in their historical narratives. With regard to the Black radical tradition of resistance, West underscores how Robinson unearthed distinct praxes of Black struggle. Robinson is right, West writes, to accentuate the non-European sources of Black resistance. With a note of caution, West gestures to the potential danger of an overly rosy view of the Black radical tradition, or in his words, of a romantic, idealized conception of a monolithic and homogeneous African past, free of social contradictions, cultural blindness, and economic injustices. West suggests that Robinson came close to falling into that trap, quote, when he claims that indiscriminate violence and brutality, these are Robinson's words, did not come naturally to African peoples due to the resolution of conflict in Africa by means of migration and resettlement rather than by fratricidal warfare as in Europe. Despite this, West appreciates the project of disarticulating or untangling the Black radical tradition from a Marxist framework. Now, by contrast, regarding the third part of Robinson's book, Dr. West does not find Robinson's reading of Du Bois, of C.L.R. James, or of Richard Wright very legible. He doesn't see those authors in Robinson's work. Du Bois's relation to the Black nationalist perspective was far more fraught, Cornel West writes. C.L.R. James remained, in his own words, a Black European through and through, and Wright's protagonists, such as Bigger Thomas, were individualist and atomistic, Cornel West argues, hardly contributing to the creation of a black community. And Bigger Thomas, West reminds us, murdered his black girlfriend, Bessie. Now, despite these disagreements, Cornel West uplifts Robinson's book because of the work it does, namely to push us to confront the most important questions today, namely how to understand and imagine the struggle of oppressed peoples. West concludes, quote, Robinson's efforts make us recognize that this deepening of reflection in regard to race is the only avenue to follow if Marxism and black radicalism are to be vital in the years to come. Now, as this passage makes clear, and as the earlier passage that I flagged made clear, West retains more attachment to Marxism than, I believe, Robinson. According to West, Robinson was not rejecting Marxism entirely. West writes, Robinson does not reject Marxist analyses, but wants to use a Marxist method in order to discredit Eurocentric practitioners of Marxism. Now, this raises an important question about Robinson's method, which I am not sure I would characterize as Marxist. The roles of culture and ideology seem to play a far greater role in Robinson's portrayal of a black radical tradition. This seems to be much more in line, I would say, with Stuart Hall's cultural studies approach, which we discussed at Marx 8:13. Robinson, with Brodel, also fractures the classical periodizations that are tied to changing modes of production. And this raises many questions, the chief of which is ultimately the relation between the black radical tradition, as articulated by Cedric Robinson, and the writings of Marx. In other words, the relationship between the black radical tradition and Marxism more generally. And these are, of course, the important questions that we will need to address at our next seminar. So let me welcome you and Professor Cornel West to Marx 1013. Thank you.